Last presentation today is Martin Holdridge, who is with USGS and NAU. Martin's going to talk about sort of the implications of all this for sagebrush vegetation, and we are only 10 minutes left, so I'm hoping, Emma, that's okay if we just keep this open and go to the ends of Martin's talk. If anybody needs to leave, that's the way it is. We understand. If you're interested, just reach out. We can get these slides to you and make sure that you can look at the content or answer questions. So with that, I'll turn it over to Martin.
Thanks, John. Yeah, so as John mentioned, I'm going to be talking about kind of broadly climate change impacts on sagebrush vegetation. And I wanted to just start out by kind of outlining one perspective on what some key components of sagebrush vegetation are. So of course, there's sagebrush, predominantly big sagebrush, perennial grasses, forbs, and then also some undesirable species, invasive annual grasses being number one, and then also conifers can vary in abundance in some areas. So broadly, what I'm going to be talking about is some kind of historical trends in sagebrush vegetation, and then kind of potential climate impacts on these main components of sagebrush vegetation, as well as then kind of broadly implications for overall plant communities and habitat quality. And I'll also provide a list of some resources for folks who want to dig a little bit deeper. So as we've kind of heard some other talks today, invasion by annual grasses is super kind of concerning problem in these ecosystems. And so cheatgrass and other species come in, and then they can crowd out native species, and they can also further a fire grass cycle because they senesce earlier in the season, they dry out, they're flammable, and then sagebrush does not recover well after fire. So you can have this fire cycle. However, one thing I want to point out is this figure on the right. So this is showing kind of the amount of area that has transitioned into a sagebrush dominated state in the last few decades. And so the top color is showing areas that have transitioned even in the absence of fire. And so that's basically showing that, this can occur even without fire. And of course, in the places where you do have that fire cycle, the invasion can be even more extreme. So another widespread change in these ecosystems is encroachment by conifers, largely junipers. And this map here on the right kind of provides one perspective on that change. So that's showing in places that are red or rangelands where in the last 2 decades, there's been an increase in tree cover. And you can kind of see that that's a pretty widespread pattern throughout the sagebrush region. So a recent effort, the sagebrush conservation design effort, kind of tried to create an index that took these individual components of the ecosystem and using kind of remotely sensed data could kind of come up with a single number that sort of approximated the overall ecological integrity. So the sagebrush ecological integrity was defined as being a function of the amount of sagebrush, perennials, annuals, conifers, and human modification on the landscape. And so sagebrush and perennials have a positive effect on the score, and annuals, conifers, and human modification have a negative effect on that score. So this map is then showing what happens when you take that score and kind of categorize it into 3 bins. So in dark blue are areas that are core sagebrush habitats. So those are areas with high sagebrush ecological integrity. They have adequate amounts of sagebrush and perennials and not a lot of threats. Kind of intermediate sagebrush ecological integrity areas were called growth opportunity areas. Those are shown in light blue on the map. So they might have less perennials or something, or more of a given threat. And then in tan are other rangeland areas. So those have lower sagebrush ecological integrity. So they may not have a lot of sagebrush or perennials, or perhaps they've got a more extreme invasion by annual grasses, something like that. And now I'm showing that same map, but for 2001. And so again, I want you to focus on the dark blue kind of core high quality areas. And I'm going to show you the same map, but for 2020, so 2 decades later. And you can see there's that dark blue has definitely shrunk a lot. And so I'll go back to 2001 just so you can see it again, and then forward to 2020. So that's reflecting, roughly a third of core sagebrush areas being lost in the last 2 decades. And so a lot of that loss, the majority of that loss is being driven by increases in the cover of annuals. And then, of course, there are other threats going on, including just increases in encroachment by conifers, changes in land use, and so forth. So now I want to change gears a little bit and think about vegetation components and how they might respond to climate change. So starting with sagebrush, sagebrush covers a very wide climatic envelope. It's growing in hot and dry places, cool and wet places. Kind of because it covers that wide area, it's also likely to be able to persist under a lot of future climate conditions. One potential exception being kind of the hottest and driest portions of the range, which will get hotter and drier, and then sagebrush may not be able to persist. This map here on the right is kind of showing, I think, a pretty good perspective on that. So this study compared multiple different models to provide evidence for kind of increasing or decreasing performance of sagebrush under future climate conditions. So in dark blue are places where there's some decent agreement that sagebrush could do well under future climate conditions, while in red, where it could do worse under future climate conditions. You can see that those red areas are largely in kind of the lower elevation or kind of southwestern, hotter, drier places. Now thinking about perennial grasses, largely you can lump perennial grasses and sagebrush ecosystems into 2 broad categories. The first is the cool season or C3 grasses. Those are kind of the dominant, most common grasses. And then there's the warm season or C4 grasses, which tend to be less common, but also found more in areas with more summer precipitation and also some warmer places. And so there's a fair bit of evidence to suggest that these 2 groups of grasses might respond differently to climate change. And that comes from individual plant modeling, species distribution modeling, and so forth. And these maps kind of show one perspective on that. So in general, it seems that the cool season grasses, the C3 grasses, are likely to respond negatively to climate change, while the C4 grasses are more likely to respond positively to climate change. However, there's quite a bit of uncertainty with that C4 grass response because they don't grow everywhere. So they've got a little bit more limited ranges. So a question is, will they be able to establish in new places in the future and thereby increase their presence? And I think it's ecologically important to consider this question of these 2 groups of grasses, because if you do change in dominance, that will be kind of important as far as forage, because the cool season grasses develop earlier in the season, they mature earlier. The other ones, the warm season grasses mature later in the season. So it would change kind of the availability of these, the timing of these grasses for grazers. Moving on to invasive grasses. So in general, I think the sense is that, the historical trend in cheatgrass is likely to continue in the future and not be, mitigated by climate change. And as we heard, wildfires likely to increase in a lot of places due to hotter and drier conditions. And that could then exacerbate, this cheatgrass fire cycle that we're seeing in so many places. And I don't want to leave out some other vegetation components that are, of course, very important. So forbs make up the majority of the diversity in these ecosystems, and they're important to wildlife, even if they don't have a ton of overall biomass. But not a lot is known about how vulnerable they may be to climate change. So that group has not been well studied overall. Conifers, I think the general idea is encroachment is expected to continue in many places. But again, there hasn't been a ton of work looking at how conifers in these systems might respond to climate change. One thing there is, some work that has been done for junipers suggests that at least in the near term, through much of the range, they will still be able to be growing pretty well. Climate will be suitable for their growth. So it's not that climate will necessarily stop. Climate change will stop kind of ongoing encroachment. Now kind of transitioning and thinking about kind of more broadly the sagebrush ecological integrity again and how that might change in the future. In dark blue here, we're seeing these are, again, the core sagebrush areas, high quality sagebrush areas. And those are places that are core now and we're projecting will remain core in the future. And you can see that that's actually there's quite a lot of that area across the whole map. And then where we do project some declines or changes, those changes are generally declines. So that in the light red, for example, those are places that are core now and we project won't be climatically suitable to be core in the future, potentially. I also wanted to make you aware of some data sets and resources that are available. And we can happy to share these slides so you can get this. And one thing I want to highlight also is on the bottom is a report by Scott Carpenter that'll be published later this year that we're involved with. And that's going to be, that includes kind of a much more in-depth review of the literature on sagebrush ecosystem responses to climate change. And we'd also be happy to share a draft of that. So that goes into a lot more detail. And kind of to summarize, I wanted to kind of touch on the main kind of trends and patterns. So first, vegetation is changing in sagebrush ecosystems in some places to a large degree, and that's especially due to invasion by annual grasses. And climate change can be thought as a potential amplifier of some of these ongoing changes, can exacerbate some of these ongoing problems, like from invasion by annual grasses, which could affect also, core sagebrush areas and other areas. However, these impacts of climate change are kind of going to be varying geographically. So just to provide a couple examples, in the south, it's already hot and dry, and that'll be likely further stressed by increasing temperatures. In the northeast, there may be shifts in seasonality towards, for example, drier summers, which may benefit cheatgrass. And then in other areas, at least, doesn't seem like cheatgrass's threat is at least unlikely to diminish. And broadly, there's a lot of uncertainty in vegetation responses to climate change in these systems, but there are places where there's some fairly robust signals. So the good news is there are some stable intact areas, and those will likely still be climatically suitable in the future. On the other hand, there are places that are already degraded, potentially hot and dry, very challenging to restore even under current conditions, and are likely to get hotter and therefore potentially just not possible to restore to an intact sagebrush ecosystem in the future. And one thing I want to kind of mention as a caveat is that a lot of these studies and a lot of these projections aren't fully incorporating potential increases in climate extremes that we've heard about in some other talks today. And yeah, if you have questions, please feel free to reach out. I know we're a little bit out of time.